Thank you everyone for joining. My name is Colin O'Brien. I am a part of the product management team for our DevOps solutions here within ITSM at ServiceNow. And today we have this webinar scheduled for how we can help you kind of accelerate innovation by connecting your DevOps tools to ServiceNow. So as a part of today's presentation, I'll be the one primarily driving for today. However, we also have two people on my team, Isaac Bartz and Joe Offenberg, that will be monitoring the Q&A. So as questions come in, please use the Q&A panel. We'll also monitor the chat, but I believe the Q&As get captured better and we can follow up if need be. So as you're asking things, they'll be answering or will be interrupting me for something that would be good for kind of the broader audience to hear. So again, feel free to keep this interactive. If you have questions, ask them through the Q&A panel. All right, so for the webinar today, I don't have any plans to go over anything that is forward-looking. However, just to keep the lawyers happy, we're going to make sure that everyone knows that if there are any forward-looking statements, they are based on plans and not to make any decisions based on things in the future for today. And also we have more webinars coming up. So in the chat, there should be links that that will allow you to register for more of our events. So definitely, as we're going through this, please use that to find out all the other events that we have going on. All right, so for today, I kind of have three things at a high level that we're going to be going over for today. First is an overview. The DevOps product, and I've been with this product line since the beginning. That has been renamed from originally it's just called DevOps to DevOps Change Velocity. And for many of our ITSM customers today, they are not aware of how this solution was designed, what it's supposed to do. So I'm going to give a brief overview of that. But the bulk of today is going to be how the journey looks for you to adopt DevOps Change Velocity within your organization. And we'll be going through really how to get started. And we'll be walking through exactly what it takes to get going through this entire journey, because it is something that is meant to be adopted over time. So you will add more and more to the automation capabilities based on your needs, based on where you are in your DevOps journey and where you are in your automation journey. So why did we really get into this space within ServiceNow? Why did we start working on this several years ago? And what we found as we were working with customers, especially within the enterprise, is that it can be very hard to scale DevOps within enterprises. Adopting DevOps within individual teams or within groups of teams is, I'm not going to say it's easy. It's definitely not. It takes work. But as it really broadened to the rest of the organization, it can get really hard, and it leads to a variety of issues. The ones that we were hearing the most is that there's really that lack of visibility and traceability. Teams all are setting up their own tools, so different teams are using different tools, or even when they're using the same tools, they have lots of instances of it that don't know about each other, that don't talk to each other. And so there's lack of visibility, which makes it difficult to kind of share anything between the development teams, and especially the operations teams that are going to be consuming this data. And because of that sprawl of all of these tools that the teams are implementing, it makes compliance harder. I was working with a customer very early on that would spend several person weeks just pulling together everything when any kind of compliance went through. So they were spending about 3 to 6 weeks, depending on team, just in adhering to these compliance checks. And that's because, again, it's sprawled all over the place. And then we found that the actual delivery time wasn't getting a whole lot better. That the development teams were building faster, they were building more repeatably, but because of the prior two issues, there was still a long lead time from when the new versions of their products are ready, when the development teams and implementation teams are ready, to when things are actually going to go out into production. So while building products was becoming far more repeatable, the actual time to deliver it was not decreasing significantly. So this has caused challenge across a lot of different personas. Development teams. In my background, I've been a developer. I have lots of friends that are still developers, and they are really just like spending time with more of the administrative tasks, tracking people down in order to get approvals. They want to be doing what they love to do, which is building stuff, and they want to spend more time doing that. The higher level, like VPs of app dev, they don't have a good handle across their end-to-end teams. Again, different teams using different tools. There's really a lack of visibility across the value stream. The change team, they are under pressure to deliver more and faster. However, they're still being held to the same compliance requirements that exist today. So they still have the same regulatory concerns, but now they're asked to do far more than what they ever have in the past. We actually had one customer that told us that as they were wanting to help get things out faster, they're like, there's 4 of us and 400 of them, and we can't meet the scale that they need. Operations has issues because there's still that lack of visibility. They don't know what's going to be running in production. And from a compliance, a governance officer, when everything's spread out, they're not sure that we are actually meeting whatever, sometimes legal requirements that we have to adhere to before we deploy any of this into production for customer use. So what we have been working on is, well, how do we fix those things? How do we help fix this problem? And we focused on, well, how do we help the developers not spend a whole lot of time trying to flag down people for changes? Going to CAB meetings when the data is already there. They've already done this work, but the change team isn't aware of it. For those VPs of app dev, how do we give visibility across the value stream, across all of their teams? With the change team, how do we help them to scale? Instead of having to review changes, how do they help the teams to understand what those requirements are, and just help the teams that are needed, and really automate ultimately that change process for when things are going right? For operations, they will have a faster ability for turning around resolutions to incidents, so MTTR going down, because they have a full picture of what it is that they are supporting. And then obviously from a governance perspective, we're able to pull and collate all of this data together, so that when audits take place, it's not just that they're faster, but we have a far higher confidence that they have all been met. All of our policies have been met because we've just been doing it as a part of our general process. So let's talk briefly about what it is that ServiceNow actually built. So we refer to it as DevOps Change Velocity or DevOps Change Automation. You'll sometimes hear automation and velocity swapped around, but ultimately it's about working with the tools that your teams have in order to solve those problems that we just went over. So we will connect to your development team's tools like Jira and GitHub and Jenkins and Bitbucket and Azure DevOps and GitLab and a host of others. Pull relevant amount of information from those tools into ServiceNow. So that allows the teams to continue to use the tools that they are using, but ServiceNow has, I'll call it the metadata about this. So we'll know about the stories that they're working on. We'll know about the code commits that have gone into modifying these products. We'll know about the builds and the tests and the security scans. And not only will we know about them, we will have them all connected so that it's not just that we know about the story and the code commits, but we'll know what code commits were attached to which stories. We'll know the test results of the build that is going out into production and what all the code that it was connected to that, and therefore the stories that we're actually deploying. So it's connecting it and creating traceability around all these records, all these artifacts that are coming from different tools and generally don't know too much about each other. Now, how does that become interesting? Well, visibility is interesting into itself, and we're going to show how you can start with just getting visibility into all of this data that's spread out across all these tools. But the next step comes when we want to automate that process. So oftentimes I'll work with customers and they'll have change policy documents that will say, in order to go out, we need to make sure that all stories have been accepted by the product owner, that the tests, like our unit tests, are at 100% passing, that security scans have been run, that there are no large vulnerabilities within what we're deploying. And all of those are spelled out in a Word document. Well, instead, why don't we just have in ServiceNow an automated system that looks at the data and makes that decision automatically to say, did you follow the policies that we have in order to deploy to production? So now we can take this connected data and make that decision automatically instead of having people spend time when you've met all your criteria. And this is a couple of examples that we've used with customers about builds being successful, that there aren't any open incidents, that your tests are passing, that we're not in a maintenance window, or sorry, that we would be in a maintenance window, we're not in a blackout window, in order to say whether or not we authorize this change. And then also helping to really see across that value chain that how are we doing? So are we getting better? Are we getting faster? Are we becoming more reliable? Which are all of the goals that DevOps teams strive to reach by measuring what's going on across all of these tools. So we, again, have worked with lots of teams at this point to integrate these tools into ServiceNow and automate their change process so that we are reducing manual activity wherever possible. We're able to increase that throughput, and we're able to make sure that we're doing it while at the same time adhering to the governance requirements. So you basically get the best world, especially the best of both worlds, especially in the governance area, where we both have the compliance, but without the overhead that typically comes in when people are going through and doing all of that manually. And it's an example of one of our customers that we worked with early on. They were spending lots of time on just tracking down people for the change, but you'll see that their lead time was usually at least 1 week. So this is actually one of the better customers that I had been working with. Most were closer to a 2-week period of lead time from when development was done to when something could actually go out. Some were as long as a month, but they were about 1 week, and it just turned into next available. So we had eliminated the time it took to create changes. We eliminated the time it took to find the people for approval. We eliminated the amount of time development was spending with handovers operations, and moved deployment lead time from a week to just when's our next window that's open. And then the actual time spent approving became effectively automated. And those are the kinds of results that we are seeing with most of our customers that we have been working with as they have been automating their change process in this way. So I said at the beginning that this is a journey. Doing full change automation is the end goal where you're having all of your policies evaluated by ServiceNow. However, getting there isn't something where you have to do it all in one, kind of one implementation, where you're just going from we haven't automated a thing to we're fully automated. It really has this journey, and this is the journey that I'm going to be walking through for today, which is how do we get our teams and our tools onboarded? what does it take to do that setup? And I'm going to be actually doing I'm going to be walking through that process for today. Then we get to change traceability. Now, if you have been if you're one of our customers that's been working with us for the past several years, the change automation at the end is what you are used to. But we came out with new capabilities early this year with San Diego that we're going to be highlighting in this webinar today, which is how do we provide visibility without changing your process? I would say, as I've worked with a lot of customers, both during our early adoption phase all the way through until we became a GA product and for the years after that. And getting to full automation usually took a good bit of time, not in doing any kind of implementation in ServiceNow. There is definitely things to do in ServiceNow to fully implement it, but most of the time was on whiteboards, defining what that process should be when you remove people and add machines that are going to be evaluating this. So almost every customer that I worked with spent time saying, let's not just add our policies, let's really look at what our process should be and basically implement that new process for our DevOps teams. So we wanted to have something that you could get started without doing that. And that's change traceability, where you're able to connect what your development teams are doing to change requests to increase visibility without having to change any of your processes, without having to change anything about your change management setup. And I would honestly say that as we're going through this, that is something that's all done through the UI, and it's something that you could get started with even today after we get done with this webinar. That was the goal. That's why we put this together, is that you can do this without really bringing in any kind of implementation help. And then the next step after that, after change traceability, we refer to as change registration. This is where we start our automation of the change process by creating the change requests in a repeatable fashion with the data that is needed automatically. So this doesn't automatically authorize the change, but it automatically creates the change. And this came from working with customers where when we started digging into it, the amount of information captured on the change varied a lot from team to team, because not every team knew what should be on their change requests. So change registration makes it a repeatable process to where we have the right data and we have the same visibility, but without going to full automation of your change process. That's the fourth step, automating the authorization process, really automating the change process so that people are only involved as an exception case when your policies aren't met and you need people to get involved. But if everything is going as it should, people aren't needed in order to do that change process. And that's the ultimate goal, where we decrease the risk, we increase the success rate, because we have a fully repeatable process where we have data that is always evaluating whether or not we have done what is necessary in order to get those changes out the door. So with that, we're going to go into that adoption journey. And I'm going to take this in phases. So the first thing that we're going to do is go through the tool and team onboarding process. Now, there is a one-time setup that your admins have to do, and that is setting up a credential for what we call the Create DevOps tool. I will show you what that is. And that is simply necessary so that we can automate the onboarding of your tools and of your teams through these catalog items that allow us to just ask information like, what is the tool? Where does it live? What are the credentials? And then we do the rest of the setup. So with that, let me switch to my instance and start going through how we do that initial setup. Okay, so I am, yes.
There are some questions on the chat. Do you think this is a good time to quickly take them?
Oh, certainly. Yep.
Yeah. I'll ask the first, maybe Isaac or Joe can ask the other one. So there was a question asked around as you were showing the list of tools, there was a question asked around, are AWS build processes or pipelines supported?
So we have a partner that has implemented an integration with AWS code pipelines. I believe that's what they're called. Lots of tools out there. So we have a couple of customers that are using that, and the partner actually releases their integrations open source. So the partner is RapDev. And as follow-up, especially if that's in the Q&A, then we should have captured who did it. Otherwise, as follow-up, we can send you a link to that integration, which brings up a quick point I want to make. There are lots of tools out there. We built a framework for how to integrate tools with ServiceNow if we don't have an out-of-the-box integration. We have really taking care of most of the plumbing, where you simply have to think of it like a transform, where you have to take whatever data they send to us through webhooks. So webhooks are the technical how external tools send data to ServiceNow, but we just need to transform what they send to us into the JSON format. And if JSON isn't, it's JSON, that's a new term for you. It's a common format, much like XML. That is used for moving data between tools. We need it in a certain format that is documented on our documentation site within ServiceNow. We need it to look a certain way, so you perform the transform. That's it. The rest of it is taken care of by us. The endpoint management is taken care of by us. How you do connections and credentials are handled by us. We just need that transform in order to put the data that they send us into the right tables. You don't even have to know our table structure, just the JSON format. So again, RapDev has built an integration with AWS code pipelines, and we will send that link as a follow-up today.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah.
Colin, we also have another question here. Might ask for some more information, but the question is, can we talk about the Google Cloud Platform build process?
Yeah, so we may need a little bit of additional information, but we typically don't, you can use Google, you can use GCP, you can use Azure DevOps as your compute platform. And from our perspective, we do not care what the tool, like what your cloud platform is.
Yeah.
We are connecting more of your development tools to us. So if there's some specific testing related data, as an example, then that may be something that we look into, but I'll probably need a little bit more clarification for GCP specifically. Because again, if you're using Azure, AWS, or GCP, we work with them. We don't really need to know what your underlying infrastructure system is.
Okay.
Are there any other questions before I continue?
Let's continue.
Okay, perfect. So we'll come back to insights toward the end. It's just the dashboard that I tend to land with. But let us begin with the connection and credential that I said is a one-time setup. And this is something that your ServiceNow admin has to set up. So within ServiceNow, there is something referred to as connection and credential aliases. And connection and credential aliases basically are storing what it sounds like. We need to know your ServiceNow instance, and we need to have a user that basically is authorized to be able to create records. And this is documented on, again, on our website. But there is one that will be there when you install ServiceNow DevOps. When you install DevOps Change Velocity, this particular record, which is called Create DevOps Tool, will be there. But what won't be there is at the bottom, there is a connection that has to be created where you will specify where it is. So I'm on this VSM demo 1 instance. So I have to put that. And we also have to specify a credential, which basically is I have a login that I'm using and a password that I have as well. And that is used, again, to automate the tool creation process so that we can do it through catalog items, which greatly simplifies the process. And so again, that is a one-time setup that your admin has to do. Everything else will happen as you want to onboard a new tool or as you're wanting to add a new app to being something that you manage through this process. So let's go into how you will actually connect a new tool to ServiceNow. So first of all, we can go to a service catalog. So I have just placed these 2 catalog items on the regular service catalog. When you are working with your team as to where it should go, you can place it in whatever location just kind of makes sense. I placed it here because it would be very quick for me to show from a demo perspective. But especially if you're using like Service Portal, it might make sense to have the catalogs listed there. And these catalogs, there are 2 of them, 2 catalog items. One is DevOps tool onboarding. The other is DevOps app onboarding. So tool onboarding is what you do first, because we need to know about the tools before we can connect that data to your apps that you're going to be managing. So you'll click on tool onboarding. And this is something that, again, depending on your organization and what their level of comfort is with your teams creating this, most of our customers that we are working with allow the teams to do this setup. And that's because the teams already know about the tools that they're using. Now, you can have, because it is a catalog item, you can have a process where it needs to be reviewed and approved by someone within the development organization or someone within your ServiceNow organization. I have it set up to where it would auto create it, but all this basically is giving things a name. So this would be, for instance, Collins ADO instance. May not be the best name. I'm just going to use it for now. And then we need to know what kind of tool we are integrating with. So whether or not it is an out-of-the-box tool or whether it is something that was created by a partner or by yourselves, because customers can certainly build these integrations. We intentionally designed it to be straightforward enough that it doesn't require a partner if you are handy with doing integrations, but it will show up in this list. So this is the list of all the integrations that I currently have installed. This is not the list of all tools that we support. We have a lot of tools between our store and lab where you can have a pretty long list. I just like to keep mine short to just the ones that are commonly used. So for instance, I could choose Azure DevOps. That's what I selected for today. That's what I typed, at least in the name. And then we need to know the URL and the username and the access token. So the URL, for instance, in this case, would be, move my Zoom window out of the way. It's going to be this particular bit of Azure DevOps. So I would have this here, and then I would specify that that is the URL to the tool. In that case, it's a project that I am working on. And then we need a username. Usually this will be a system user. I would just type in, for instance, mine at servicenow.com. And then I would have a personal access token that I would put in here. I'm just going to type something because I'm not going to create things just in the interest of time. So I would have an access token that Azure DevOps would be supplying for me. And then we have 2 options down here at the bottom. One is, do you wish to configure webhooks for the tool? And the other is mid-server. I'm going to actually start with mid-server because this is a very quick answer. If you are using a tool like, let's say, Jenkins, that is housed within your network and has no external access so that ServiceNow couldn't directly talk to it, then you'll need a mid server. If this is, and I've had customers where it has been installed within their network, but it is externally accessible, so they didn't need to be on VPN or anything else to access it, then you don't need a mid server because we can directly connect to the tool. So if you're able to connect to it without being on your company network, then you don't need this. But this will be this will be the go-between for the times, and Jenkins is probably the most common tool that needs a mid server setup, that you would need to select this box so that we can know to communicate through a mid server. It is common, and this is probably the number one pitfall that I see when customers are needing to set up a mid server. And this has been pretty common, there is a good chance you already have some mid servers set up within your instance today. However, it is also a pretty good chance that those mid servers also cannot see the subnet that is set up for your development tools. So you will need to make sure that the mid server that you work with can actually see the DevOps tools that your teams are using. I've seen that as probably the number one issue that has come up when a customer has set this up and it says, hey, it's not working, or this actually happened to me, it's working sometimes, because some of the mid servers could see it and others couldn't. It is because of where the mid server is and whether or not it can see your tools. So if you are running your own hosted versions, be aware with mid server setup, you will need one, and you will need to make sure that it can see your tools. Azure DevOps is in the cloud, so I would not select that for today. Now, the other option that pops up, and this, if you were really paying more attention than I would expect, because I wouldn't have probably noticed this myself. This did not show up by default. It showed up when I selected Azure DevOps. For some tools, that would be Jira, Jenkins, GitHub, and Azure DevOps, we can communicate with them instead of with webhooks. We can just directly, ask them for data periodically, and that is to help with the onboarding process. Setting up webhooks tends to need admins of the other tools that you're talking to, and getting credentials is usually one of the hardest things to do within an organization. So by not needing webhooks, you can actually circumvent that process, and ServiceNow will just periodically grab data from these tools when it's needed. Usually it's on a nightly basis, where we just collect the data from those tools instead of it being in a real-time fashion. So if I do not check this box, then that's all I need in order to connect to Azure DevOps. I need to give it a good name. I need to say that it's Azure DevOps I'm working with. I need to specify the URL, and then I need a username, and usually it's an access token, not a password, which your development teams, especially again, if you allow them to, and I do recommend that you allow them to be able to set this up, they will know that information. So they won't have to go somewhere else in order to complete this step. After that, they hit order now, and that creates the tool. That's all that's needed for getting tools connected. So I don't see on the Q&A anything pop up, but were there any questions that came up related to tool onboarding before I do the app onboarding, which will be next?
None, Colin. Keep going, please.
Okay. So that's connecting the tools. The next is how we onboard the apps themselves that you're going to be running through the change process. Now, just to keep in mind, you would need to do that for each tool that your teams are working with. So if they're working with Azure DevOps and Jira, they would need to do that twice, once for Jira, once for Azure DevOps. If they're using Jira, Jenkins, and GitHub, you do it 3 times, one for each of them. So that's just something to keep in mind, because as I go through the app onboarding, it's going to need to know that you have already set up those tools to go further. So with app onboarding, we have 2 things that we can do. One, if we already have an app that we're working with, then I can make updates to it. So let's say the team has added a new pipeline, or they've added a new Git repo that they're storing some code in. Then they're going to be making updates. So we have add to existing. Then we have create new, which is what your teams will be doing at first. So we will have to give this a name. So I am really not creative. So some new app, that is my app name. It was a coin toss between some new app and Colin's app. That's my level of creativity. And then we have next about onboarding pipelines, repositories, and plans. And this is where the tools come in. Because when I look at, for instance, pipelines, what I'm looking at is which tool have I been working with? We had several that were set up ahead of time with Azure DevOps, with Jenkins, with GitHub through GitHub Actions. And I'm just going to, for now, select this JO GitHub. And that now gives me additional, I guess that was not the right one. What was the one that I used yesterday? Must have been that one. There we go. So it's number 2. So now I can see what were the pipelines that this instance of Jenkins is managing. And if I'm working with the Globex site, then I have 3 pipelines, and I can add them to be what are the pipelines that my team uses. And you can filter down through search. So as I'm typing this in, it will filter out the ones, because oftentimes you'll have many in this list. Your teams will know their names. So again, a team would go in and say that this is available. And then we can import to bring historical data in, and then do the exact same thing with your repositories. So if I have, if I'm using GitHub, or maybe I'm using actually an Azure repo, I can use that in order to kind of change what it is that I am looking at, to look at all of the repos that are available, select the ones that I have and add them. And then finally, we would do the same thing for onboarding plans, which will ask what tool to use for planning. I have several here. I've got another Parts Unlimited. I've got some Jira, and by selecting that, it's going to show me the plans that I can also add. Now, what this does is if I go to my DevOps apps, and again, I'm going to be not creating, just in the interest of time, this will create an app which will have all the associations related to it. So this app knows about what are the plans, the repositories. So I've got a Git repository. I've got 2 pipelines that are being used. If you're also using something like Artifactory, then we can see which artifact repos that are being used, because we're trying to connect all of this data. Now, what does, again, connecting all of this data do? So going back to the traceability, this allows you to raise a change request that has all of that data associated with it. So let's real quickly create a new change request. So this is just going to be a normal change request. Not going to do anything really fancy. But this change request that I'm going to create, I'm going to say that it is a DevOps change. This is a new version of Colin's app. And oftentimes I find that in the description field, you will have, what are the stories that are going to be going out? What are the test results that are going to be going out? Instead of typing all of that in, we have this option for add DevOps data that will show up, that will allow us to connect the information from those tools to our change request. So I'm going to choose, we have 3 different things you can choose from. Release version is basically pulling in from your planning tool to say that here is, for this particular release, here is all the data that we are going to be looking at. And when I click next, it's going to show me all of the things that we found as a part of that release version. So we have a single work item. I can see any code commits, any test summaries, any software quality scans. All of that will be added so that when you submit it, it's now attached to this change request. I'm just going to save it. And you will see it at the bottom of our change record. So we are able to show, so for instance, this actually had some config data. It's got some stories, any of the information that we were capturing as a part of that change is now going to be here at the bottom instead of your teams having to type it all out. So that is going to allow us to have an increase in visibility on the change by simply collecting data from your tools. And again, if you get nothing else, if you decide I'm going to drop from the webinar right now, which, don't, we have 15 minutes left, got 2 more things to show, and you just did that, you will help to increase visibility, to increase, honestly, the governance as well, because all of it's connected to this change. And you will be helping your teams to have a more repeatable process on what they are working on and how that is tied to your changes. And I have done that in the past, a little over 15 minutes, I think 20 minutes. And that was also explaining what we were doing as we went in. So we designed that first step to be very straightforward, easy to do. All it really takes is knowing your tools and letting your teams do it. Your teams can provide that information so that when they raise changes, they are able to attach the data without changing their process at all. So real quick, before I go into change registration, I wanted to check to see if there were any questions on the Q&A about, yes.
Sean, we've got a great question here, very timely for where you are in the demo. The question from Sean is, how do DevOps apps map to CSDM?
That is a good question. So we generically refer to this as an app because every term that we were using had some connotation to it that we didn't necessarily want to to override. So we generically refer to things as apps. What we found is that, and I don't think I have any of these pre-set up with them, but we have a link to business application, which was the most common CMDB item that related to apps as we were working with customers. So we have a direct link here. Now, as an evolution as a part of CSDM 4, we have another field that's been added for this model ID. I'm not going to go into that deeply today, other than it is explicitly for being compliant with the with CSDM 4 and with working through the business application, the SDLC component, and some other areas of CSDM 4 and how they relate to your products. So most customers are using Business App as the kind of generic what the product is, and the model ideas for future as more customers implement CSDM v4. Any other questions that have come up in the Q&A?
Yeah, just one more. And is it possible to create new cases with CLI or API calls?
Yes to both. I would say API calls, there are endpoints that ServiceNow provides for creating change requests. We have, so this actually flows into the next part, which is change registration, where we have for some of the tools, we need plugins. Others, it just kind of works natively. So with, for instance, Jenkins and Azure DevOps, we added plugins to make it easy. So you don't even have to know about our REST APIs. But we definitely have REST APIs for creating these changes. And that's, again, what most teams will either use those APIs directly or will use these plugins to create their changes as a part of the process. So in the interest of time, I'm going to go through the change registration, which this will allow teams to add a task into their pipeline to raise a change. Now, what information should go on the change? We have a variety of ways to do it. And so let us move real quickly into that. So I'm actually going to go into Azure because it has a way to see it visually easier than Jenkins does. And I'm going to edit this pipeline. So I've already set up this pipeline to work with ServiceNow. And you'll notice I have in my pipeline, this is a YAML pipeline. So if you're not familiar with Azure DevOps, that's just how their pipelines are created. We have a task that's called server change acceleration. And if I click on settings, it will show me what it is that we have to provide in order to raise that change request. The top part, mostly you ignore. The interesting area is this bottom section here where it says change request details. And by default, it's empty. By default, you don't have to do anything other than that you want to raise a change request at this stage of your pipeline. However, you can add additional information that we will send over to the change request. So if you want to have the requested by name filled in, you can do that. If you want to set the dates, you can do that. Any of the fields on the change, you would be able to specify in this kind of JSON payload, which you can actually copy it as a starting point and paste it in here. And instead of start and end date, I could have some other field that I want to add. And this will be sent over to that change request so that when it is raised, it will fill in this data. So this is that next step in your automation where you will be filling in these change requests automatically. Now, what that looks like is if I go to I'm going to pull up a change. Let's just pull up of course, my changes all fell off. So open change requests. So what that looks like when it is raised is we have a change that will be automatically raised, and it will be filled in with data that comes from your CI/CD tools. So out of the box, we will fill in, we'll give it a name. This can be configured to where you want it to say something else. We will fill in your information about it. And we can also fill in things dynamically so that if you want to know as a part of your analysis, here are the results in text form, then you will have all of that data here, filling out backup plans, test plans. One of the first customers I worked with this on, I asked them to show me what a good change request looks like, and their random sample of change requests that they clicked on, most of them were not filled out correctly. And nobody knew, just nobody had noticed. So the first thing we did was turn this into a repeatable process where the development team didn't have to go and find all of this and fill it in. It was simply filled in as a part of raising the change request. And when it's raised in this way, it will still show the connections that you have when you are doing visibility as well. So we'll know the tests that were there. We'll know which work items were there. We'll know any software quality scans and what's going on with that. So this raises the change request in an automated fashion without automating the authorization process. That comes next. So when you reach this step, the key thing to know is, what should our change request look like? Like, what should it look like every time? And then you will work with your development teams to add a step in their pipeline that raises the change request and either passes in information that's known to the only to your CI/CD pipeline, or you can again, you can use data from within ServiceNow to also fill out these results dynamically, like this one where I'm looking at outages and incidents. That was dynamically pulled. There is a flow that you can modify that will be able to look at any data and fill that in to your change request. Next step is the final one, which is with change automation. So are there any questions? This is a pretty short step. It's important because you need to know what should be on the change every time, but all of this is built to the final piece, which is change automation. Are there any questions on the Q&A for registering the change before I get into automating the change. Okay, then I'm going to move on to the last bit, which is the actual change automation itself. So for this, we're using capabilities that are in change management today called policies and policy inputs. So let's look at our policies. So I have a policy that I'm going to use that has inputs first. So inputs are, what is the information that we are going to evaluate? What is it we need to know? That'll usually be something like your percent passing of functional tests and percent passing of our unit tests. It could be how much error budget is remaining. It could be how many security vulnerabilities are there. This is an example. You will define these, and it's defined by just selecting a new button and giving it a name and a type. So usually it's numbers, but it can be other things like strings or even references for dot walking. You'll define these inputs because they're going to be based on your process. You have to know what your process is, and you have to know what you're going to evaluate in order to do this. And then it gets to the decisions themselves, which we have, what are all of our policies? So if all of our policies are met, what does that look like? So in this case, it looks like there have been no outages in the last 7 days. There are none currently, no open incidents. The service criticality is less critical. So you can use things within ServiceNow also to define whether or not to do this. You can look at how much error budget's remaining. We've got at least 10% of our error budget remaining, and there are no JFrog X-ray violations that are here. This is also defined by your development team, like by your change team, looking at the policies, making sure that we have this data. If all of these things are true, then we have an outcome, which is our, in this case, we're going to approve the change request automatically. So if all of this data, so if it's raised by your pipeline, all of this data is true, so all of these conditions have been met, then it's going to auto approve it. But we don't have to just auto approve it. We can also reject it. So we could say this is high risk and we auto reject. So if it's high risk, there could also be circumstances where we want a manual review. So if it doesn't meet either of these, the last one, so it kind of goes top to bottom. The last one is a manual review, which goes to people. So this can still go to an approver or a group or to CAB. It's not just about saying we're going to automate the, automate the approval or rejection. It's automating your process so that you have the correct outcome based on data. And that's what all of this builds to, which is using this data that we've been collecting, that we started with visibility, that we moved on to registering the change, and then finally, we've gotten to fully automating the outcome of the change authorization. And if all these things are true, then we tell the pipeline, continue. If all these things are not true, we tell the pipeline to stop, don't deploy. That is that ultimate goal where we will automate your change request, but it is, again, a journey. I should have put the slide again. I'm just going to move back to it here. This is a journey that goes from onboarding your teams, connecting that, and finally automating the approval process. So with that, we have about 3 minutes. I tend to go right to the line. Are there any other questions on the Q&A as we wrap up for today?
We've been answering them as they came. There was a question, maybe as people think. We answered it, but you can answer live, Colin.
Mm-hmm.
That will help others, I think. So the question is, how does this pull info such as work items and others automatically? Is it sent from Jenkins, or does ServiceNow pull that information together?
Yeah, so we are pulling data from each of the tools. So work items, that's the generic name for like stories or epics or features or defects. We generically refer to it as work item. That's going to come from your planning tool, like Rally or Jira or Azure DevOps as examples. We connect that because Jenkins made a build that we're going to be deploying. And that build, we know which code went into it, and we know what that code was tied to which stories. So by collecting data from across all these tools and linking it all together, that's how we're able to specify, well, what are the stories that we're going out. And again, with that build, you would also have security scans typically run. So we'll be able to say, okay, what were the results of those security scans? Because it's all tied together. And then we're able to walk all of that as it's attached to the change request. So are there any other questions? Otherwise, I just wanted to, again,
there's just one more, Colin. I think it's related to what you were just talking about. So the question is, how does it know which items to pull in?
So when you are going through that initial app onboarding, you're specifying which backlog your team is looking at. It could be a project in Jira, as an example. And then when the code happens, as they're checking in code, most development teams will reference the story ID as a part of that code commit. And so we are able to link that together. Jenkins tells us what code commits were in those builds. So we look at all of the tools and how they tell us about their relationships, even though they don't store those relationships. We rebuild them in their totality because we will look across, like SonarQube will reference what build it was a part of. So we connect all the dots. And so when you are deploying, you're deploying a build or an artifact, especially if you're using an artifact repository. And because that artifact is linked to the change, we're then able to walk all of it. We have relationships set up specifically for being able to answer that question. All right, so we are actually 1 minute past. Again, I want to thank everybody. There is in the chat a link to additional webinars that are coming up. We have another DevOps webinar coming up in, I think, a little over a month, or right at a month. So we would love for you to join that one as well. And so as we wrap for today, again, just wanted to thank everybody for attending. Thank you for the Q&A, so we can keep this as interactive as we can make a webinar. And we will certainly follow up with the questions that have been asked, especially with regards to where some of the open source plugins provided by partners resides. So with that, thank you again.